Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video view series, where we take a look at the adventures and supplemental material, the Dungeon Masters Guild website. For this video, I'll be reviewing the adventure Away with the Faeries, designed by Baden White for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links if you're online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Manuel, Wizard Princess, Christopher, Star Loverly, Thomas, Ldugs92, and Ian. And gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcos did Vicente, Gilberto, Adam, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Ross, Limpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Sclenia, Nick, and Party McButterpants. Thank you all very much for your support. Folks, there have been so many great content for the Feywild and for Faeries. I'm still waiting for the official, D&D 5e adventure that's going to finally utilize so many great classic storytelling ideas and characters, and obviously all the monsters that are available, all the creatures that are available in the monster manual, and since in the years since they've been releasing monsters. We have yet to see a good officially published 5th edition adventure with Faeries. Thankfully, there are a lot of good ones on the DM's Guild. This one, I think, is my favorite. I think it's my favorite fairy-related adventure, and actually goes into the Feywild, takes place primarily in the Feywild. And it's at level 2, which is even more impressive, but it does such a wonderful job of utilizing all the different checkboxes when I think of fairies and fairy-related adventures. There's bargains, there's boons and curses, there's talking animals, there's mazes. Just a wonderful mixture of all of the elements when I would consider making. Because when I think of a fairy adventure, I don't mean I just want a dungeon crawl in a forest that has a bunch of fairy creatures in it. That's not really doing it enough. That's just you're switching out the pieces. But if you're actually creating the Seelie and the Unseelie courts, and the fairies that are weak to cold iron, and the way they speak in like rhymes and curses, and they're very fickle by nature, like all of those things are what's really, really great about the fairy storytelling. The fact that they exist like on the peripheral, like this dimension that you can kind of enter, like a dreamlike world. It's just, that is the good stuff, and this does that so very well, and it is very well organized. It's wonderfully organized. 5 chapters, so it breaks down every little piece. Because it's not a one-shot, but it's obviously not a huge, campaign either. You're pretty much designed for, I believe, just a single level. So I would consider that a little bit more than a mini adventure. It's 30 pages, which is pretty solid. But to break it down into 5 chapters is awesome. And each chapter has a paragraph at the start that's like, hey, here's what's going to happen in this chapter, and here are the focuses of this chapter. Like, is this chapter a dungeon crawl that focuses on combat or exploration? Is this chapter primarily a social encounter that involves just role playing and maybe some skill checks? That's awesome. And then for the actual introduction, it has all the things that I want. It gives me a background of what's going on in the story that the DM needs to know. Give me a summary of the adventure from chapter 1 to the end chapter. What are the players going to do? What are they going to face? All that stuff. Give me multiple adventure hooks for why the players are in this area. Just fantastic. Huge thumbs up for that. So to go over the adventure, starts out the players arrive in this town of Stonebridge, and they've been called here because of missing townsfolk. Well, the mayor kind of exaggerated a little bit. It turns out they're actually missing all of their animals. So all of their livestock, as well as all of their beloved pets, have gone missing. And it's up to the players to kind of investigate. And it turns out that they have been not kidnapped per se by the fairies that have a portal nearby, as much as conscripted, because the fairies came in, they sprinkled magical fairy dust on the animals and essentially cast the awaken spell on them with an enchantment that causes the animals to be motivated to go help defend the fairy. The fairy king, they call him Pixie King, but he actually has a proper name, and do not address him by anything else because that is considered a slight. I love that whole sequence. Is under attack by a neighboring fairy, and apparently he has a pact with the town of Stonebridge that if either town gets attacked, they literally have like a defensive pact, then the other one is supposed to come to their aid. Now, obviously, time works differently in the Feywild, so if you spend a day in the Feywild, then weeks, if not months, go by. So clearly, while the fairies are still thinking this pact is good, like generations have gone by in the town, and they've long since forgotten that fairies exist, which again is an awesome story element to pull through. Now, the fairies aren't evil, which I think is a really clear, interesting aspect to it. There are certainly some bad, like gremlin-like fairies that you'll need to fight, but they're not just like an evil invading force. They're all about the bargains, and they're just another faction. They're very whimsical and difficult to deal with. So, and the Pixie King, instead of taking the townsfolk as, conscription, he takes the animals in the hopes that he won't have to take the townsfolk. This is actually, kind of helping out there. But, if push comes to shove, he will start taking the townsfolk. So, there's a really fun first chapter where the players can explore the town. It's very well organized in that it's, obviously broken down by different meaningful areas the players can go to. They learn about the different missing people. They can gain clues as to what has happened. Like you might find a tiny sword in a lockpick, like the little pixies have kind of jammed it in there. There's a lot of fun little trails like that you can pick up and discover. The most important being there's kind of a crazy old gnome who turns out was found his way into the Feywild by the neighboring forest. Always got to be a forest. And has actually some fun information, clues in the forms of his mad ravings that you can kind of glean, including the fact that you can gain his journal, which he wrote down during his adventures later when you actually go into the dungeon, which is there's two really fun teases in the town that actually come to fruition later on. And one is the gnome's journal, which you can acquire later on. And the other is the well, which they tease the fact that the well has divination magic, and that's actually how the fairies spy on the people. And then what's really fun is later on, when you're deep into the Feywild, you see the other end of the well, and you can see the townsfolk on the other side talking about like the players. That's such a cool scene. I love that. And if the players have short rested, then a week has gone by. If they long rest, then like months have gone by. So they'll see the people talking about like, oh man, I guess those people are dead because they are long gone. Really, really fun opening chapter. It's just purely exploration based. There's like kids that you can talk to and interact with. One of them is pretending to be a troll, and he will try to get a toll from the people. And of course, there's going to be a real troll they'll deal with later on in the Feywild. One of them you can just buy a spell book from that they took from like their grandfather's attic or something. And it's a real spell book, and they can just pay whatever because the kids don't know. I think this is just really fun moments and just a really neat idea of bringing the adventure to a really fun introduction. And on top of all that, there's some really good information about helping new DMs and parties. Now, this is designed to be for level 2. It says it can be adjusted for first or third level, although there are no actual like mechanical adjustments for doing that the way a lot of Adventures League style adventures do. But you could probably shift it not too difficult. I would say first level is always a bit of a bummer to do extended sessions in, so usually the first thing you do should get you at a first level basically. But it does a fun job of like, hey, when the party's on the road, have them all, introduce each other. And then, during different events, it'll be like, hey, make sure each party member has a thing that they can do. It just has a lot of extra advice and helpful things in there that I appreciate. It's not, somebody, and veterans in general might not need this advice, although it's fun to be able to read that and kind of nod and say, yes, of course. But for new DMs and parties especially, that's very welcoming information. And it's not obtrusive. It's never, patronizing or anything. It's just generally helpful, like, hey, here's how, here's a good way of running this session for new players and to get them more engaged, get them talking about their characters, role-playing and all that. So I do appreciate all that. So they get caught into the Feywild, they, investigate the clues, they see, there's one fun bit where they can even hide out like in the stables, because there's a horse that has not been taken, and it turns out there's a horseshoe that's always outside the door, and of course fairies abide by the no iron rule. And if the players happen to remove that stable, they can do the horseshoe, they can do a stakeout and essentially watch as the horse suddenly decides to leave, after seeing some invisible creature sprinkle some magic dust, and they can follow that horse who's been newly awakened and just like, oh, I gotta go help the Pixie King. And they can follow him into the mushroom ring where they are transported into the Feywild. Really, really great flavor text here throughout. I'm not going to read any of it because it's kind of lengthy, but just a good job of painting the picture of how kind of otherworldly and beautiful and eccentric the Feywild can be. There's really fun notes about how it can change magic, not mechanically, but thematically. So, for example, I love that healing magic brings forth tiny fey spirits that work diligently to repair wounds as if repairing shoes. Just add that little bit of extra touch on there to make it seem like they're in this, we're not in Kansas anymore kind of, area, which is really fun. There's a complications table where if the players rest, and most of them are not, combat related, they can meet a very important NPC called Teacup, who is a rabbit who is actually not one of the awakened animals, but instead is just a 100-year-old Fey creature who will join forces with the players following a battle. Now, the one complaint I have about this adventure, I appreciate having, obviously this full color battle map is very lovely looking. However, the adventure does a very odd thing that I've actually not seen any other adventure that I can remember doing, and that is using a extremely different art style for every single map. There's only, I believe, 3 maps in this adventure. One of them is this specific combat encounter, which is a bunch of these little bogey gremlin creatures, and you have to save the teacup rabbit, so pretty much the only real forced combat encounter. There's the map of the town, which you can see here, which is a completely different style. This is a grid map that's kind of very basic, and it does have color in it, but it's more abstracted, whereas this one is much more like a painting. Just looks absolutely gorgeous. And then the later map of the maze dungeon outside of the final boss's ballroom, I guess, is just a black and white grid map. So it's very odd that the designer went with a completely different style. So on the one hand, I appreciate having maps. On the other hand, and I've never seen anybody do this using a completely different art, it's just pulling random I would have much rather had a uniform style. Granted, it would suck if the uniform style was all of the black and white grid maps, because at least something like this I could use this on a VTT. The town map you could use, but it's not very attractive. Although you don't need this map, it's technically just a nice visual aid for the players in terms of being able to walk around to different pointed areas and feel like they're in control rather than just kind of telling them, hey, which area do you want to go to? But the actual black and white grid map like this, I would not be able to use in a VTT. It's just not looking good. Although I love the DM notes about what you have to do for each tunnel. We'll get to that in a bit, but it's a fun design, but it's very odd that we use different map styles for each one. There's a really fun bit where you can interrogate the bogeys. They all speak in riddles, and there are helpful sample riddles to talk to. As it mentions, hey, if you're not comfortable doing this, here are some sample ideas. Otherwise, just have them talk in nonsense. But they are loyal to their leader, which is the new upstart pixie called Velrath, something like that, who is attacking the resident pixie king. So Teacup can help lead the players to the pixie king to help, because that's where all the animals have been taken, and that is a gigantic skill challenge. Now I know skill challenges are a bit divisive, but I think this one does a pretty good job. First of all, it doesn't have the hard fail on it, which is important. There's a ton of options here. The idea is the players roll a D100 and have to overcome some event that has an individual failure penalty. Let's see, what's an example? Your shadow begins to pull away from you from the group in order to frolic in the woods. That's just a fun Fey thing that can happen. And the penalty is alone. You disappear and return at the end of the skills challenge. Some of them, a prismatic fog suddenly rolls in around you and sparks of magic erupt from it. If you fail, you must roll on the wild magic surge table. Some of them are just damage. A lone cyclops emerges from a cave, begins to hurl crudely made javelins to the party. If you fail, you're impaled. You suffer 1d6 piercing damage. And a skill challenge means you can basically use any skill. It's very, kind of abstracted, and the players can just come up with a method. You can use any skill or means to overcome the challenge, and then you roll that skill. The DC is 14 for all these by default, but you can kind of, change it as you wish. And then you need to accrue 8 successes, which is a lot. That's a bit much. Before you accrue 3 failures. So we're looking at maybe around 10 or so of these events. That's kind of a lot. I guess maybe you do one each, maybe 1 or 2 each is kind of what I'm thinking of, depending on the party size, which we do have 5 players, so that would be 10 of them, but it does seem like a bit much. But thankfully, none of these are combat related. They shouldn't take too long. I think I would have ultimately preferred if we had been given 3 to 4 scripted events that the DM could choose from to roll, and have them be more interesting and more thematic and allow the players more options and, just things they can do. The disadvantage of that system is those could always lead to combat, which can slow things down, but you do want to offer that option to the players. And the advantage of this system is that by their very nature, you're only looking at one player at a time, so you highlight everybody. They're in initiative. It actually says to do initiative order, so you're specifically making sure everybody gets a chance to shine, everybody does a thing, and we keep the action moving because none of these are going to lead to an actual combat encounter. So I do appreciate how that works, especially. They do seem like a bit much, but I think they're all very thematic with the Feywild. They do what they need to get done, and this is just one part of a bigger adventure. If this was like 1/3 of the adventure, that would be, I think, a little bit worse. But the adventure is actually far longer than just this skill challenge. So if you're going to do a travel montage, I don't actually have that big of a problem with it. And there's a fun section here where Teacup gets to talk to the players, and again, that's the DM advice coming through, where they can bring forth, that player interaction a little bit more. When you enter the Pixie Kingdom, this is actually probably one of my favorite parts of the adventure, because it's an extended social encounter, and there's a really interesting part where the players have to keep this Pixie King happy. He's got wishes and whims, which are like a mental checkbox the DM has to keep track of, versus slights. And the players need to keep the Pixie King happy, because they can be rewarded if they do. They can gain the benefits of a long rest freely with a feast, and they are given the option of taking a powerful boon that only lasts for the course of this adventure, because it's Feywild magic, at the cost of a very interesting kind of curse, basically. And in fact, it can only be removed with a remove curse spell, I believe. Or if the players piss off the king, it doesn't, which is good here, that it does not do a hard stop. It doesn't lead to combat or anything like that. It just means the players don't gain those benefits. They don't gain that long rest benefit. They could still gain a long rest if they wanted to, but then they have to abide by the time shift rules versus the free long rest. And if they even still get offered the boons, but then they get the unfavored cost rather than the favored cost. So for example, and the way I would roleplay this is I would just say, hey, here are the boons you could have: the blade, the truth, the form, and not explain what those are to the players, because I think that would be a really fun risk-reward system. And the true favored cost, which means the king is happy with you, means you cannot wield other weapons without having disadvantage on attack rolls. That's not that bad, because it's just for the purposes of this adventure. And, I don't know if I think the cost would be, the effects of their payment will differ depending on... The true costs are permanent and can only be okay, so this is different. The true costs are permanent and can only be ended using the remove curse spell or similar magic. Now, granted, that does exist in D&D, so you could just get it removed, but that's important. The benefit only lasts for the purposes of the rest of this adventure. However, the curse is permanent. So you cannot wield other weapons without having disadvantage on attack rolls, but the boon is that you get a +1, or your weapon that you like becomes a +1 and becomes magical. So pretty good boon for level 2. You might accept that because, I'll just use this weapon from then on. The unfavored cost, if the king is not happy with you, you still get offered the boon, but the cost is that you are unable to put the weapon down and must have one hand on it at all times. A lot of these are role-playing specific. For example, the shield, you can use a reaction to gain a +2 AC until the start of your next turn. The favored cost is that you lose a memory, or a year's worth of random memories from when you were early, like before your 5th birthday, which most people don't have very good memories back then anyway. The unfavored cost is that you lose all memory of the last year from just prior to your arrival. And another one is you lose all motivation to complete your character's personal quest. You lose the ability to speak. You lose your name. I thought that was a really clever one. Let's see, for the form, you gain a form of the druid's wild shape ability. The favored cost is you can no longer speak your name aloud, but the unfavored cost is you never had a name and you can never be given one by yourself or anyone else. These are really cool ideas. It's not just mechanical stuff. It's actually changes how the character can role play and gives them another tool that they can use. I think this is an awesome system. I love the fact that it doesn't deny you the boons. It just gives you a different cost depending on if you piss off or keep the king happy. So it's a really interesting extended social encounter that at the end involves a reward, and that reward can change depending on how that social encounter worked. Freaking phenomenal way of putting this all together. Absolutely awesome. And then the adventure culminates with a dungeon crawl in a really fun Fey-esque maze, with each of these rooms being connected by a magical tunnel, and each tunnel has something that you need to decipher, like a riddle that involves having to do nothing that involves a skill check, basically. One of them is to pass this way and remain the same, you must travel the way from whence you came, which means you just have to walk backwards through the tunnel. So they're kind of silly, fun things. They're not designed to really slow the players down. They're kind of a fun way for the players to figure out. One of them is they have to be singing while they're doing. One of them they have to, I love the one you have to walk in height order. So you have to put everybody, which is something that most players probably don't even know about their characters. So you have to put them in height, which means including the little teacup rabbit character. One of them you have to hold hands while going through the tunnel. Really, really fun ideas, and I love the annotations here. They're all, again, riddles that are inscribed on the tunnels the players will have to decipher. That's kind of the skill check. It might even be fun if the players fail it to where you might only get certain words is something I would add as a DM. Maybe you only know parts of it to try to figure it out. And if you fail, you just end up in the room back where you start. And thankfully, there's multiple branching paths. So even if you lose one, you should be able to make your way across. And then each room has different things you'll have to deal with. The well is in one room. There's dryads in another room that offer the players food, but the food ages you. There's a troll the players could fight or pay the toll troll. There's a treant that the players, let's see, what is it? It's the judgmental tree, where they have to just do a joke or basically make this tree happy, and it's just a performance check, and if they fail, it's just, so none of them are necessarily a combat encounter. Now all of these could obviously be a combat encounter, but that's not really how the Feywild operates. It's more about like having fun social encounters and skill checks and all of that. So if your players are more hack and slashy, first of all, I'm not sure they would enjoy a Fey-themed adventure in general, but I think using that theme strongly enough, and you can always give them the option of combat, I think there's enough here to really even have those players have a lot of fun. And then the final encounter is with, let's see, what is your name? Verileth, which is this the very fickle invading Fae who is not even really thinks of themselves as war with the Pixie King. In fact, they are basically, turns out they're going to leave soon anyway. They're kind of bored with the whole thing. However, obviously the players still have to go through a series of either a test of wits or a test of mettle. And the test of wits is a series of basically skill challenges and riddles, which are all pretty fun. One of them, so there's a fun thing where that teacup rabbit that I mentioned earlier that accompanies the players and is the classic, like, hey, we're going to put you with an NPC through the whole thing, betrays the players at the end. But interestingly enough, it's not really a big evil, shocking betrayal. It's more like, oh yeah, I was just spying on you for Verileth, and I'm still a happy, like, nice rabbit. Just it wasn't really intended out of evil or malice. And then during the test of mettle, it's like, hey, do you want to kill the person who betrayed you? And they like bring out the rabbit like in a knife, and that's a whole test. And of course, whether or not the players even accept or not, the Verileth doesn't even allow it to happen. They were just wanting to see what the players' reaction were, because they're always studying mortals and seeing how we react. It's really, really good stuff. And none of these things are ever like a hard stop or a game over or anything like that. It's always like, hey, this is just the fairies fucking with you, and they're really good at it. Or the players can choose a test of mettle, and Verileth summons this giant rose petal dragon that can fight the player. If you just like, all right, you guys want to play D&D, we'll play D&D, and we'll just do some hack and slash with a dragon. So really great stuff. I love the options there. There's a nice epilogue where the players, the actual, because the Verileth will just leave at the end. They're like, okay, we're good. I've learned enough about mortals here. And so the players can return to the Pixie King, and he will agree to let the animals go, but the animals still have the awakened intelligence, so it's up to the animals themselves on whether they want to actually return to town or not. And there's a little bit of fun there where some of the animals might want to stay in the Feywild, and others will be willing to return, knowing they will actually lose their newly found awakened intelligence. So, and most of them do decide to leave with the players because they, especially the pets, they like their owners. And I like to think that most of our pets would return to us if given the chance. So I love this adventure so much. It does such a great job of course it was Marco Bernardini. That's a gorgeous map. Really, really fun adventure. And let's go over my pros and cons so I can continue gushing about it. Pros, it's extremely well organized. I know a lot of adventures are technically well organized, but this one really does go the extra mile. I especially love the beginning of each chapter, which includes a full paragraph and even includes focuses on clever use of skills and roleplay. This chapter is a dungeon crawl with elements of combat, exploration, and roleplay. Just first of all, it's broken up into 5 chapters, which is great for an adventure that's not technically that long, although it is longer than a one-shot. And then it has a perfect introduction that explains everything, adventure summary, background, all of that. Great sidebars throughout, really fun. And that's another actual pro I have is the helpful tips and advice for new DMs and parties. And it's like these little sidebars down in the corner, as well as just helpful advice for like bringing the players out of their shell and getting them to role play and encourage. And a lot of that, even like that skill challenge is like, hey, put everybody in initiative order. And that way everybody's taking their turns doing the skill challenge. That's great advice. So really good stuff on there. Pro, the adventure balances role playing, world building, dungeon crawling, and a travel skill challenge. It has all of those check marks, not even of a Feywild adventure, but just any adventure in general should absolutely strive to have a very good balance of all of those things. If I had to say, it's a little light on forced combat encounters, but that is the thing to be light on because, as we all know, most encounters with a monster can definitely lead to combat. So I'm not really concerned about usually not having enough combat because this one definitely has options for that. But it is a little bit low in terms of it doesn't have, an extra, especially if the players decide not to do the fight at the end with the dragon. There's really not that much combat relative to the size of the adventure. The Pixie King's Gifts. I especially love that section. Offer interesting boons with drawbacks as a reward for a pivotal social encounter. As I just mentioned throughout the middle of this review, I adore that entire section where you can gain these really interesting boons with very interesting permanent curses. And it actually the curse actually depends on the social encounter that happened previously with the king. Awesome. My only con is the jarringly different art style for each map is just very odd. I've never seen an adventure do that. I strive for consistency every time. Obviously, I would prefer if the consistency was more like Bernardini's maps rather than the kind of Dice and Logo style maps, because I'm somebody that plays on a virtual tabletop, so I appreciate that a lot. But just some kind of consistency, because it is really weird that was the chosen method, was just to use a completely different map style for all the different maps. Final verdict: with boons and bargains, pompous fairy kings, talking animals, and riddle-filled mazes, Away with the Fairies is a wonderfully thematic adventure in the Feywild. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. You can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.